How do you grow a company in what I would call a hyper-competitive environment that we live in today? And that environment isn't going to change. Growth is more challenging than it's ever been. A lot of times companies have relied on market forces to provide most of the trend of their growth. And people would say, if you're growing at the rate of the market, you're doing fine. Except now the markets are only growing, if they're growing at all, they're only growing at 2 or 3%. So you can no longer call yourself a growth company if you're growing at the rate of the market. So that's point number one. And the second point is that disruption's inevitable. Disruption's inevitable when you think about technology, standards, government regulation. Disruption can come from many, many different sources. Well, I do a lot of work with multi-generational family companies. You do one generation to the next, is it the same company? And the answer is no. It can't possibly be the same company from one generation to the next. Or even your companies can't be the same company they were 10 years ago to what they were now to 10 years from now. Over any period of time, disruption's inevitable. Aikido masters take the energy of whatever's coming at them and flip it and turn it to their advantage. To be a long-term winner, become a disruptive competitor or get disrupted. And by disruptive competitor, I mean two different things. The ability to disrupt your competition, call that big D. The ability to operate externally in the world as a disruptive force. And little d, you also have to be a disruptor within your own company. If you're going to keep evolving your company, you have to periodically break patterns that have existed and break legacies that have existed in your company. And that's what I would call little d. One of the key ideas that I want to introduce is the difference between innovating and innovation. For years, I would say to people, you know, innovation's broader than just products and services. It's really broader. And what I found out was people were wired to think innovation meant, what are you doing in products and services? You know, the scorecard is what revenue are you getting from new products and services in the last 5 years? But if you said how much value or valuation, if you're a privately held company, how much of your valuation is just in your products and services? The answer is it's only 5 or 10%. It's the rest of the spectrum that's providing most of the value and most of the profitability. I like to use the word innovating to represent that you're looking across the entire spectrum. You're looking at business models, the ecosystem. You're not just looking at core processes, you're looking at enabling processes. You're looking at channels of distribution, e-commerce being obviously the biggest disruptor that's come along in the last 10 years, and innovating on the emotional appeal. You're looking at your customer experience, including the design of things, like how an iPod shifted the customer's experience and created enormous value for Apple. And you're looking at culture, because high-performing or innovative cultures outperform on every metric. So we want to look at innovating across the entire spectrum, and that's what I want to focus on today. So that's the first key idea, is the difference between innovating and innovation. I was trained as a physicist. What I loved about physics was physics had first principles. And from first principles, you could derive the behavior of very, very complex systems. I like to do that in reverse. I like to look at very complex systems and figure out what are the first principles that are driving behavior. Then, if I can transfer those first principles, other people can adopt that and create new growth values for themselves and their companies. Where I often look to get first principles is I look at people who are really successful. Reverse engineer what might have been going on and how they've approached it. Now, they're doing it in a natural way. Steve Jobs is a natural at what he does. Bill Gates is a natural. And that's what I'm doing here, is reverse engineering, looking for what you can then apply as a first principle in any way you want to help your business to grow. One of the key things about that is growth heroes see things differently. They walk into markets and see opportunities that traditional people do not see. They make sense of those opportunities in a very different way. They see things that weren't readily apparent, and they're serial disruptors. See, it's easy to look at disruption like a startup. and you go, startups are supposed to be disruptive, but if we talk about how people have serially disrupted their company, then there's something applicable to an established company and helping it to grow, whether it's a mid-sized company, family-owned company, private equity-owned, or whether it's a publicly traded company. A way that I ask people to think about it is to think about it from the perspective of different lenses. If I have you put on a telephoto lens, you're going to zoom in on something and you're not going to see the bigger picture. If I have you do a wide angle, it's the reverse. You're going to see the big picture and you're not going to see the details. These are lenses that are the result of my reverse engineering what I think growth heroes do to have been serial disruptors in a big D and a little d way. So I'm just going to go very quickly through these lenses. Bold aspirations. Everybody that you think of as a growth hero is somebody that you recognize they were out to do something. They had bold aspirations for size. They had bold aspirations for impact. What that looks like, that's very different for growth heroes than the way traditional people think about growth, is the following. Everyone knows the S-curve. At the early stages, very little momentum, very little growth that you can really notice. You're gaining momentum. You hit that rapid part of the S-curve. At some point, your company or that product line becomes mature and you kind of level off on the growth curve. Most companies, the point at which they start getting concerned and the point at which they start looking for new growth is when topped out. They've matured out that area of the product line. The growth heroes think very differently because the growth heroes plan out the next generation while they're in the rapid growth stage. If you think about Apple, if you think about Amazon, they never waited until they plateaued in a particular area before they introduced the next big idea. Here you have companies that have thought that way, Tesla, Facebook. Here you have companies that could have thought that way and never did, Barnes & Nobles and Twitter. Next one, out-innovating the competition. So the idea here is we're innovating across the entire spectrum of value. We look at the company and we say, where are we out-innovating the competition? Where's the competition out-innovating us? Where could out-innovating the competition and ourselves give us a disruptive advantage? And you can map that back to how the growth heroes have actually disrupted themselves. An example of that is Nespresso. Nestle is the largest supplier to retail in the world. When they introduced Nespresso, they broke a lot of eggs. So one, they're now in the equipment business. They weren't in the equipment business before. Instead of selling coffee at retail, if you want to buy coffee, the Nespresso, you have to buy it over the web or you have to buy it over the phone. So you can imagine the tension that that created inside the company when you have all these people whose bonuses are based on selling coffee at retail. Nespresso then innovated an organizational model where they spun out a wholly owned subsidiary in order to commercialize Nespresso, because they knew if they tried to commercialize it within the bounds of the mothership would suffocate it. That's an example then of the out-innovating idea. The importance is being an outsider. We get caught up in looking at the market from inside the company outside. And so when we think about disruption, we think about it just in terms of the world as we're seeing it, and our lens is inside out. So disruption is about why are we losing customers? An important aspect is looking at the market and looking at your company as an outsider does, looking at your company as a customer would see it, looking at your company as somebody from even outside your industry would see it. Richard Branson is noted for walking into industries that are very stable and disrupting them, because he's bringing a very outsider-in perspective on the established industries. Stretching the edges. Oshkosh, the heavy-duty truck, stretched its edges into waste disposal and fire engines and military vehicles. Johnson Controls stretched over 100 years from sensors to motors and actuators to total control systems to building control systems, and now they're a major player in the Internet of Things. You go to the grocery store. There's a market there underserved, and it's underserved in fresh prepared food. A way of growing also is there's assets you have that are underutilized. They're non-monetized assets. So if you think about United Healthcare, it had an enormous amount of non-monetized assets in the form of information around doctors, patients, prescription. So it created a separate business called Optum to monetize the information that United Healthcare had accumulated, changing buying pattern. If we're in a zero-sum game and somebody's going to change their services, a way to think about it is they're changing their buying pattern. Instead of buying services from somebody, they're buying services from you. They've broken a pattern. How you go about breaking patterns, first, you have to have people in your organization who are much more the hunter than the farmer. Farmers are good at maintaining relationships. Hunters go out and break patterns. Instead of looking to make incremental improvements and to be a little bit better than the competition, what are new attributes that would delight people in my target market? What are attributes that currently enrage people? If I can eliminate an enrager, that gives me a disruptor in a buying pattern. So you now look for those delighters and enragers. From an inside-out point of view, we look at our company as the sales cycle. But people don't buy on your sales cycle, they buy on their buying cycle. So you want to understand what all the touch points are, and the best disruptor here is not to improve a touch point. The best disruptor is to introduce a new touch point and own that touch point in the marketplace. An example of that is Grainger. It's a $7 billion maintenance and repair organization. You're a maintenance VP of a company, you go to Grainger to get parts. An enrager is the effort and distraction of finding a repair part when you have an unplanned problem come up. The delighter is reducing the expense of unplanned maintenance expenditures. 40% of expenditures are unplanned. They created a customer touch point called the pain chain model, and they would go out and educate customers on the hidden costs of unplanned maintenance and how to reduce the hidden costs of unplanned maintenance. And they trained the sales force to become hunters by making that presentation. Dismantling orthodoxies. No matter what your industry is, you've got orthodoxies within the industry. This is how the industry operates. And then you've got orthodoxies within your company. Everyone knows this is how we operate. Example would be Minute Maid. If you said, what's the orthodoxy for Minute Maid? What do they sell? Orange juice, going back a few years. When did people use it? Breakfast. Who buys it? Mom. Who do they buy it for? Kids. So you'd start to challenge those orthodoxies, and you go from orange juice to healthy drinking. You go from breakfast to anytime. You go from moms to teens to seniors. And then what do you start to do? If you're going after teens, you brew flavors that teens like. You put packaging that teens love. You do advertising that's funky, and you're disrupting the orthodoxy of the industry. You're disrupting the orthodoxies in the company. You're finding whole new spaces in order to grow. Technology enablers. Your business isn't about knowing what enabling technologies, but in every industry today, there are enabling technologies that are becoming commercially viable, financially profitable to utilize, that have disruptive potential. An example is Earl Energy, where a big problem for the government is shipping fuel oil to outposts in Afghanistan. So somebody came up with an idea of clean tech energy in a box for the military. And what the box, a shipping container, contains is a generator, runs on gas, a battery, and photocells. So the photocells charge the battery during the day. Electricity runs off the battery during the day. Overnight, when you're running it, you need to recharge the battery. You use the generator, and the net configuration of that uses 10% of the fuel oil of a traditional way of providing electricity. It's done with off-the-shelf components. A lot of times big companies don't go into something because they can't see that it's going to be $100 million in 3 years. And if it can't be $100 million in 3 years, they're not interested. But you could have something that's 20 million, 30 million, 50 million in 3 years, and that's huge if you're a middle market company. In summary, growth is more challenging than ever, and disruption is inevitable. So therefore, use the thinking of an aikido master in order to use disruption to your advantage. I introduced the idea of innovating as a much broader perspective on all the dimensions of value-generating activities within a company, whereas innovation is focused on product and service offerings. And we talked about the different lenses that growth heroes may be using in order to find disruptive opportunities for growing their company. If you want further information about my availability for doing speaking or workshops, or if you're interested in the core services, I welcome you reaching out to me at my contact information that you see on the screen. I hope you benefited from and enjoyed today's presentation.